Seeing Insomniac's logo attached to a Spider-Man game is a match made in heaven. It's hard to imagine a developer better equipped to bring the colorful, action-packed and humorous world of Spider-Man to life. If we take a look at Insomniac's history, the studio always carried the DNA of the Spider-Man universe in one form or another. The colorful art style of Spyro, vast variety of creative gadgets and self-conscious humor of Ratchet & Clank, and fast-paced traversal system of Sunset Overdrive all but confirm that Insomniac was born to make a Spider-Man game. The individual parts were already in place, they just needed to be put together. Spider-Man isn't a flawless game, there's still much room for improvement, but overall Insomniac built a great foundation for a franchise. Before I share my impressions on Insomniac's long-awaited title, I want to make unmistakably clear that I'm evaluating Spider-Man as a game, first and foremost. Let's say I'm not all that interested in the MCU and the current superhero hype in general. In fact, I tend to be extremely critical of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm not a Spider-Man expert by any stretch of the imagination. I haven't read any of the comics, and everything about the character that goes beyond the film adaptations is knowledge I don't possess. This critique comes from someone who isn't the greatest superhero fan. That being said, Spider-Man is one of the few superheroes I actually care about. I admired Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy as a kid. To this day, Spider-Man 1 and 2 remain my favorite Spider-Man films. The third one not so much for obvious reasons. This video was supposed to be a short 10-minute review, but it turned into a 30-minute critique instead. To my own surprise, I've way more to say about Insomniac's Spider-Man than I initially expected. You don't have to be afraid of spoilers, I saved the story and character analysis for the end, and I'll give you a final spoiler warning before we enter the most important parts of the story. However, this critique does include footage from gadgets and suits you unlock later on in the game. As long as you only care about story spoilers, you should be fine. Without further ado, here are my thoughts on Insomniac's take on the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. A Spider-Man game lives and dies by its web-swinging mechanics. Insomniac had to make sure that the traversal feels incredible from the first minute all the way to the end. A good traversal system wouldn't have been enough. In a game in which you spend half your playtime in mid-air, the web-swinging had to be perfect. Fortunately, Insomniac used all its expertise derived from games like Sunset Overdrive to create one of the most satisfying, responsive and fluid traversal systems you could possibly hope for. It's impressive how Insomniac managed to make the controls intuitive and simple, while also giving the player a great amount of precision. You can change speed, direction and altitude at any given moment. It never felt like the traversal was missing an important mechanic. As far as I'm concerned, the developers thought of every possible detail. You can run up walls at different speeds, hang from ceilings, zip to specific points in the level, catapult yourself off buildings, move around corners, and even earn a couple of extra XP by performing air tricks. There's always a point to attach your web to, even if it makes for some awkward moments in Central Park. You can swing around Manhattan and never touch the ground. Basic traversal doesn't take much effort, However, after a couple of hours you begin to notice how precise and complex the mechanics can be. To give you just one example, the bomb challenge missions require you to land as close to the bomb as possible in order to save time. Once you get a hang of the controls, you can target specific spots with great accuracy. Releasing R2 at the right moment and maintaining momentum at all times demands experience and skill. The web swinging is easy to learn but hard to master. From a technical standpoint, it's also worth to point out the natural and varied animations of Spider-Man and a very effective motion blur. The game does have a fast travel feature, but it feels completely out of place, due to the fact that swinging from point A to B is the most enjoyable part of the game. The option to fast travel doesn't hurt, it still feels odd in a Spider-Man game though. You can be at any point on the map in a matter of a couple of minutes. The traversal system is the greatest achievement of the game and the only aspect of the game I've nothing to criticize about. Yes, occasionally you can get stuck on a ledge or zip to a point you weren't supposed to zip to. Apart from that, Insomniac absolutely nailed it. What would the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man be without a neighborhood to save? Web swinging without the famous skyline of Manhattan is unthinkable. Much of Spider-Man's charm and atmosphere is a direct result of the setting. I'm sure local New Yorkers can spot all sorts of inaccuracies, but far more important is the question whether Insomniac managed to capture the spirit of New York. It never was supposed to be a perfect recreation of Manhattan. In fact, it can't be a perfect recreation. Spider-Man is a game after all. If you have to take creative liberties in order to make the most of your gameplay mechanics, you shouldn't be afraid to do so. If you have to exclude entire streets or move some buildings around so that the fast-paced traversal system stays intact, or because of hardware limitations, so be it. Some of the iconic landmarks are almost direct recreations, but overall the map is a condensed version of the real place. I've never been to New York, but I'm also quite sure that the Manhattan featured in Insomniac's Spider-Man is like a clean, romanticized version of the real thing. All in all, this version of Manhattan is beautifully realized. From steaming vents on rooftops to bustling city streets, Insomniac crafted a believable and detailed city. Apart from famous landmarks like the Empire State Building and Times Square, the game includes a couple of Easter eggs for die-hard Marvel fans. The Avengers Tower, Sanctum Sanctorum and Wakandan Embassy among others. Unfortunately, the developers decided against the dynamic weather cycle for artistic reasons. As much as I would like to see more dynamic weather patterns, certain story sections definitely benefited from this decision. At any rate, I hope we can finally put the nonsensical controversy surrounding Puddlegate to rest. Insomniac developed countless PlayStation exclusive games since PS1 days. This studio knows how to make the most of PlayStation hardware. The 2016 Ratchet & Clank remake already looked impressive, and Spider-Man improves even upon that. From a graphical standpoint, this game is great to look at and definitely didn't receive a downgrade. Even on ground level, the city feels alive, full of NPCs, cars and fully decorated shops. It's surprising how much work and care the designers put into Manhattan on the ground level, given the fact that you spend most of your time on rooftops and in the air. Although interaction with NPCs is limited, the activity on Manhattan streets is something that was missing in Rocksteady's Arkham games. I understand that Spider-Man and Manhattan are in many ways the direct opposite of Batman and the rainy, dark streets of Arkham. However, both in Arkham City and Arkham Knight, the developers were looking for an excuse to make the city sparsely populated. Don't get me wrong, the portrayal of Arkham is absolutely stunning, but it always bothered me that Arkham is completely deprived of normal citizens. In both games, Arkham felt more like a facade than a real living city. Apart from gangs of criminals roaming the streets, we never got to see a living and breathing Arkham, which is a shame. Funnily enough, there is a point in the story where Manhattan turns into the same public, empty, crime-infested city we know from the Arkham games. As beautiful as Insomniac's Manhattan is, I have one issue with it. Because you are so incredibly agile and can traverse the city at incredible speed, the map feels a little bit too constrained. That's the drawback of a fast-paced traversal system and the fact that the entire ground level is mostly adornment. Aside from some story and side missions, you barely spend any time on the ground. In most other games it is the normal mode of traversing the world. In Spider-Man it feels just wrong. Walking around the streets like an ordinary citizen in a game in which you can literally be Spider-Man feels like a crime against nature. You just don't do it. It's an average-sized open-world map, but it appears way smaller due to fast travel. I don't want more content. To be honest, I actually celebrated the fact that you could 100% the entire game in 30 to 40 hours. I'm just hoping that Insomniac finds a way to expand the world by including other parts of New York City in a sequel. Apart from the traversal, you will spend most of your time learning the ins and outs of the combat system. Apparently, criminals in Manhattan are some sort of inexhaustible resource. The city is full of randomized crimes. Before we dive into the intricacies of Spider-Man's combat, I think it's time to address a common complaint I've encountered online. According to some people, you shouldn't draw any comparisons between Insomniac's Spider-Man and Rocksteady's Arkham series because they are completely different. To be honest, I can't wrap my head around this statement. I understand that it's easy to get annoyed by comparisons to the Arkham series, since you can find them in every single review, but to outright claim it makes no sense to compare the two franchises is beyond me. How many similarities do you need before you deem a comparison justified? If you are seriously telling me that there's no good reason to make any comparisons whatsoever between the Arkham series and Spider-Man, I'm afraid I need a solid explanation. It would be wrong to suggest that Spider-Man and the Arkham games are the exact same thing, just in a different color. As I'm about to show, there are plenty of differences. But to suggest that the most successful and iconic superhero franchise in video game history had no impact on Spider-Man's design philosophy is insane. The purpose of comparing the two is not to make the claim they are identical, but we have to evaluate Spider-Man not just as a game in isolation, but as part of a genre. By highlighting their similarities, it gets even easier to point out their individual differences, of which there are many. First and foremost, it's important to acknowledge that the combat in Spider-Man should be regarded as a modification of Arkham's free-flow system. Modified in the sense that Spider-Man's more agile and fast-paced fighting style is drastically different from Batman's bone-crushing and brutish way to combat enemies. In order to do justice to Spider-Man as a character, the Arkham blueprint had to be evolved and changed. This simple realization alone should clarify that we are not dealing with a carbon copy of Arkham's combat system. Even more importantly, Arkham Asylum didn't invent the counter-combat system. What Rocksteady achieved with its Arkham series is to give this specific combat style a name and elevate the concept to new heights. Arkham Asylum reintroduced a far more complex version of the Spidey sense from Spider-Man 2. The critical and financial success of Arkham popularized the free-flow combat system and provided a template which has been copied by dozens of games since. Spider-Man 2 was released 5 years before and already contained many of the basic building blocks for Arkham's combat system. Spidey sense informed the player of an incoming attack and relied heavily on dodging and combo hits. One could even argue that Assassin's Creed 1's god-awful combat system featured similar mechanics 2 years before Arkham Asylum was released. The inspiration behind Spider-Man's combat is definitely older than the Arkham series. With that being established, let's have a look at the pros and cons of Spider-Man's combat system. Like the Arkham series, Combat in Spider-Man tries to balance the demands of players who want a combat system that's easy to pick up and are mostly interested in making their way through the story, and players who want to incorporate more style and complexity into combat encounters. A common misconception about Spider-Man and Arkham is the idea that you can easily make your way through every combat situation by mashing the same two buttons. In reality, this is only true for the first few groups of enemies the game throws at you in order to perfect your timing and learn the basics of the combat system. Throughout the course of the games, more enemy types get introduced. Enemies with melee weapons, shields, guns, and so on. In both Arkham and Spider-Man, you won't be able to win a fight against groups consisting of several different enemy types by just mashing the square and triangle button. Certain enemies require specific combos or gadgets to break their guard and make them vulnerable to normal attacks. But it's important to note that you don't have to master each aspect of the combat system in order to beat the game. Exploring the full depth of the combat system remains an option rather than a necessity. While most people probably would deem that a positive aspect, we shouldn't ignore the counterposition. If you design a rich and complex combat system, but the player has little to no incentive to use 90% of the moves, then what's the point in playing skillfully? However, as far as I can tell, Spider-Man does incentivize the use of gadgets as a means for crowd control and the use of more advanced combat techniques during fights by rewarding the player with additional tokens. If you make the decision to play as stylish and strategically as possible, utilizing all moves and gadgets at your disposal while taking as little damage as possible and paying attention to the combat challenges, you can have a blast with Insomniac's combat system. Since I already brought up crowd control, why not continue right there? The ability to control large crowds is made far easier and more creative than in the Arkham games. Playing the game on harder difficulty settings and trying to maximize your performance in combat challenges requires the smart use of gadgets and suit powers, the two most effective ways of crowd control. Gadgets like the web bomb, spider drone, concussive blast and suspension matrix are perfect to handle an overflow of enemies. You can even combine different gadgets, opening up a certain amount of creativity during fights. In addition to gadgets, most suit powers fall into the same category. That suit powers can be extremely useful as means of crowd control is introduced early on when you receive Insomniac's own version of the Spider-Man suit, which allows you to perform an aerial attack webbing every enemy in sight. I think one reason why Spider-Man's combat has a greater variety of effective abilities and tools for crowd control is connected to the secondary nature of stealth. Stealth can be used as a first strike, but eventually you are forced to engage in open combat. To give you one example, in order to take out hideouts, Spider-Man's version of bandit camps, you have to defeat multiple waves of enemies. If you eliminate the first wave of guards stealthily, the second wave is instantly aware of your position. Stealth was a far more refined and useful option in the Arkham games, which makes perfect sense. Unlike Spider-Man, Batman attacks from the shadows and only goes in guns blazing if all else fails. Stealth makes up a huge portion of each game. In Arkham Asylum, the game even tries to increase the difficulty by attaching bombs to gargoyles, which deprives you of one of the most important stealth options. Batman isn't known for teasing his enemies and making your mama jokes in the middle of a fight, but it does fit Spider-Man. In fact, Batman doesn't like to talk about his mama at all.
Why did you say that name?
In Spider-Man, the focus clearly lies on open combat. I mean, one suit even grants you the power to insult your enemy's pride. Stealth works just fine in Spider-Man, but going in guns blazing feels more appropriate to the character and allows you to use the full capacity of your gadgets and moveset.
Hey, where you going?
The most significant difference between the two combat systems, however, is the lack of a direct counter button in Spider-Man. Countering opponents is one of Arkham's most essential mechanics, and it's completely missing in Spider-Man. This simple change results in a very different playstyle despite the many similarities. By pressing circle you can avoid enemy attacks, but it doesn't result in an automatic counter. After a successful dodge, there's a variety of ways to punish your opponent. One of the consequences is that you can't rely on invincibility frames as you can in Arkham. Here, the game grants you invincibility frames during a counter, when you flip over enemies, and during certain types of takedowns. In Spider-Man, you are only truly invincible during finishers. The lack of invincibility frames has both positive and negative effects on the combat. On the one hand, it incentivizes the player to be more strategic and planning. On the other hand, it can lead to frustrating and unavoidable deaths. A perfectly timed dodge causes enemies to shoot at your last position. The bullets don't hit you because they are aimed at the beginning of your dodge animation, meaning a dodge doesn't make you invincible, it simply makes enemies aim badly. In a worst case scenario, you evade the crossfire of one enemy, but dodging in the wrong direction can still result in a hit if your dodge animation happens to coincide with the crossfire of another enemy. Even if there's just one shooter left, the direction of your dodge is important. Before you unlock the perfect dodge ability in your skill tree, dodging directly towards an enemy or away while still being in the line of fire causes you to take damage, even if your timing was right. It doesn't happen really often, but sometimes being surrounded by enemies and having several guns pointed at you in the same moment can result in unavoidable damage, since you will get hit regardless of the dodge direction. This is further complicated by the fact that enemies don't take turns during a fight. They will attack you no matter what and won't wait for other enemies to finish their attack animation. This concept is known as mock chivalry. You can be attacked by more than one enemy at once in Arkham as well, but in general, the inmates of Arkham Asylum are polite enough to let the attack animations of their comrades play out. Since mock chivalry isn't as prevalent in Spider-Man, it's easier to get caught between several attack animations all playing at once. I guess one way to avoid getting overwhelmed by attack animations is to use gadgets and suit powers as preventive measures. Still, it can be frustrating to take damage or die knowing there wasn't anything you could do to prevent it. So much for the negative aspects of Spider-Man's lack of invincibility frames and direct counter button. On the bright side, it forces you to pay attention to your positioning during a fight. You can't rely on temporary invincibility during a dodge, so you keep a close eye on the position of enemies and make sure to dodge in the best possible direction. Spider-Man's more athletic and fast-paced combat style encourages the player to constantly reposition himself during a fight. Your abilities allow for great mobility. Messing up a dodge once or failing to counter an incoming attack led to the instant reset of your combo counter in Arkham. Because Spider-Man's combat relies heavily on repositioning, the focus meter is more forgiving. The fact that you actually have to be in range of the enemy you want to attack is something I greatly appreciate about Spider-Man's combat. Pressing the attack button in Spider-Man when no enemy is near you causes you to flail around like an idiot, whereas Batman would instantly lock onto the nearest enemy and magically spin kick across the entire room if need be. Arkham's free-flow combat system could result in artificial and awkward animations. It's easy to close great distances between enemies in Spider-Man as well, but the animations look far more natural. Instead of behaving like a magnet, pressing triangle causes Spider-Man to pull himself to the next enemy using his webs. Spider-Man's web shooting abilities add a lot of depth and creativity to combat encounters. For starters, it adds an element of verticality to your moveset. By combining your gadgets and moves, you can shift the fight from ground to air at any given moment and stay airborne for long periods of time. Aerial combat builds up focus faster and is another option to avoid getting surrounded by enemies. And that's just the beginning. Web abilities can be combined in tons of different ways. You can web up enemies to render them immobile for a short period of time. You can kick webbed enemies against a wall to stick them to it. Webbed enemies can even get stuck on other enemies. You can use webbed enemies as wrecking balls, knocking down enemies around you. You can pull them towards you while being in mid-air and use them as a projectile or hit them with an air combo. You can throw all sorts of objects and even use incoming rockets and grenades against them. You can snatch weapons from their hands and so on. I'm sure there's even more I forgot to mention. Insomniac definitely made the most of Spider-Man's abilities. Oh, and since it's a video game after all, I think we should accept the fact that Spider-Man never kills anyone by doing what he does. It's still funny to think that all a 700-pound turret does when you throw it in a man's face is put him to sleep. One last point I'd like to bring up is enemy variety. Overall, the game tries to bring as much variety in groups of thugs as possible. You have enemies with jetpacks, enemies with shields, enemies with melee weapons and guns, armored enemies, brutes, snipers, enemies that can attack you with energy blasts. And one of the demon enemies even prevents you from aerial attacks by yanking you to the ground. My only problem with enemy variety in Spider-Man is that despite their small individual differences, sable mercenaries, criminals and demons all look and feel like your ordinary horde of humanoid enemies. Again, I don't know a whole lot about the Spider-Man universe outside the movie adaptations, but I expected a couple of crazy enemy designs. I'm sure there are plenty of creatures and unique enemies in the comic book universe. Hopefully the sequel can mix it up a little bit. To a certain extent the boss fights take care of that, but apart from the impressive visuals, all fights boil down to the same technique. You just throw shit at them, go in for a few punches, rinse and repeat. What I do like is the need to stay airborne as long as possible in order to avoid certain attacks. But yeah, a little more creativity wouldn't hurt. The side content is a double-edged sword. It's a mixture of challenging and creative side activities and incredibly dull, repetitive and undemanding fetch quests. Like all open-world games these days, Spider-Man copy and pastes the well-established Ubisoft formula. You probably expected to find a certain checklist of side content, and Spider-Man doesn't do a whole lot to deviate from your expectations. You will see a lot of familiar icons on your world map, including bandit camps, radio towers revealing points of interest in your nearest surrounding, and collectibles spread across the entire city. In terms of side content, Spider-Man mostly offers the same old. It's not like there aren't any merits to Ubisoft's open world blueprint, it became popular for a reason. But by now this formula has overstated its welcome to a point where it appears like developers aren't even trying anymore. It's not even the fact that activating radio towers and chasing down pigeons is repetitive, it's more about how undemanding it is to play. For instance, the demon warehouses and sable bases aren't particularly original, but at least they offer a challenge. You have to work for your victory. The same is true for the Taskmaster challenges and research stations, which are the best form of side content as far as I'm concerned. In order to reach the highest level in the Taskmaster challenges, you have to master all major gameplay mechanics. The bomb and drone challenges demand extreme accuracy and great control over the web swinging mechanics. The stealth and combat challenges require a near flawless performance as well, if you are interested in collecting as many challenge tokens as possible. There are also a couple of creative research stations, forcing you to traverse the city without your web swinging ability, avoid lightning during a dangerous thunderstorm, or stay at a certain altitude in order to escape areas of interference. In my opinion, there isn't nearly enough challenging and creative side content. However, I did notice one thing. Despite being just as repetitive as in other open world games, finding collectibles and activating radio towers didn't feel nearly as annoying as usual. Maybe it's due to the fact that the minute-to-minute gameplay is far more enjoyable than in most other open world games. Climbing a radio tower in Far Cry takes way too long and slows down your pace, whereas in Spider-Man it only takes a couple of seconds and swinging from point A to B is the best part of the game. Still, as far as side content goes, you won't be surprised by any of it.
This city's had enough of your vigilantism. You're officially an enemy of the people.
To my surprise, the story and characters are the undisputed highlights of the game. I expected a fairly ordinary and forgettable superhero story under the disguise of a AAA budget. I certainly didn't see myself getting overly involved in the characters. However, from beginning to end you can feel the passion and care people like Bryan Intihar put into the narrative. It sounds crazy, but this might be my favorite adaptation of Spider-Man. For starters, Insomniac made the smart decision to spare us another origin story. I've seen enough superhero origin stories for 2 lifetimes. That's especially true for Spider-Man. By now, the origin stories of characters as iconic and well-known as Spider-Man should be regarded as basic knowledge. He's a pop culture giant. Peter gets bitten by a radioactive spider, explores his powers, Uncle Ben dies and tells him with great power comes great responsibility, he gets the woman of his dreams. We get it. Can we please move on and explore the character further? Insomniac presents us an older and more experienced Spider-Man from the get-go. Peter is a seasoned crime fighter, already acquainted with most villains, and he broke up with MJ. The writers weren't afraid to create their own version of Spider-Man and alter certain elements if need be. Naturally, comic book fans might have another take on all of this. I for one welcomed the change. Before I talk about the details, here's your last spoiler warning. I'm about to spoil important moments of the story. If you haven't played Spider-Man yet and care about story spoilers, now is the time to go. So before I start gushing over the character and story writing, I want to check off the flaws. Great story doesn't mean perfect story. As well written as the story is, occasionally it can impact the gameplay experience in negative ways. Nowhere is this more evident than during the stealth sections of MJ and Miles. In all likelihood, the basic idea behind making characters like MJ and Miles playable was to make you care for them even more. Unfortunately, for the most part, all these moments do is sabotage the pacing. Was it really necessary to include a 15-minute stealth section inside a museum? Taking pictures, walking along a linear stealth path and solving a boring puzzle isn't the best way to spend your time in Insomniac Spider-Man. Instead of interrupting the gameplay flow for 15 minutes, why not simply make the cutscene 60 seconds longer? It's not like an awful lot happened. Just let MJ tell Peter in the cutscene that she found secret documents connecting Osborn to something called Devil's Breath. Done. Playing as Miles and MJ is like hitting a brick wall at full speed. In one moment you are swinging over the tallest skyscrapers of Manhattan, and in the next mission a museum tour guide forces you to stare at antique paintings. You aren't really excited to play as MJ and Miles because the entire gameplay experience gets dumbed down to go look at stuff and sneak past guards by throwing beeping balls or hacking objects, and by hacking I mean press one button. Most of the time you can only follow one particular path, everything else results in instant mission failure. It reminded me of the awful stealth sections in The Order 1886.
Oi, you!
That being said, there are some exceptions. The concept of several playable characters becomes interesting when characters interact simultaneously in the same environment and the game switches back and forth between them. For example, in one mission, Mr. Negative takes over Grand Central Terminal and MJ becomes one of his hostages. You can see Spider-Man crawling along the walls from MJ's perspective. You can lure enemies to Peter as you stealth your way towards the Devil's Breath device. Peter then creates a distraction and gives MJ a chance to defuse the device, only to switch back to Peter in order to take down the remaining demons. The entire section is really well done, but it's the only time this happens. As soon as the game separates the characters and plays it out chronologically, all you can think about is that you want to play as Spider-Man again. An exception to this is the first time you play as Miles directly after the demons attack Mayor Osborn's re-election event. Making the player feel powerless makes perfect sense in this particular scene. You are meant to feel the helplessness and vulnerability of the character. The game forces you to watch the chaos unfold. People are being slaughtered by Mr. Negative's men left and right, and there's nothing you can do about it. This moment not only brings you closer to Miles, it also makes clear that the writers aren't afraid to kill important characters and set a darker tone if the story requires it. Jefferson Davis is an extremely likable character, and the game spends an entire story mission to establish him only to kill him a moment later. Unlike so many films in the MCU, Insomniac's Spider-Man takes risks every now and then.
Wake up! Wake up! Hey, fellas.
Ah! Spider-Man! Shoot him!
Spider-Man is known for his wit and ability to crack a joke even in the worst circumstances. The injection of a high dose of humor is necessary to do justice to the character. Surprisingly, despite the inherent humor, optimism and lightheartedness of the character, the game's story is mostly free of the disruptive comedy so commonly found in the MCU. One of my major gripes with the Marvel Cinematic Universe is its tendency to destroy emotional character moments for a cheap and out-of-place joke. But this story knows when to take itself seriously and let important moments between characters play out naturally. The story can get surprisingly dark and serious at points, and it isn't afraid to make major sacrifices in order to raise the stakes, even if it means to kill off a greatly written character that was just introduced or a fan favorite and staple of the usual cast of characters. So, for the most part, this story managed to avoid the problems I tend to have with the MCU. The arguably best part of the story is the emotional ending, but before we get there I want to get rid of my last few complaints. Apart from Doc Ock and Mr. Negative, the rest of the villains are boring and only exist to increase the number of boss fights. I don't know if the characters are more intriguing in the comic books, but in the game they left me unimpressed. We have Big Strong Guy looking like a rhino, we have Green Poisonous Guy looking like a scorpion, Jetpack Guy looking like a vulture, Electricity Guy called Shocker, and Electricity Guy number 2 who isn't like Electricity Guy number 1 because he's called Electro. That's as far as their characterization goes. I hope these villains become a little more interesting and fleshed out in future games. I also had difficulties to believe in Silver Sable's sudden character change. She's portrayed as this ruthless mercenary without conscience, willing to kill everyone who interferes with her mission. One moment she still doesn't give a rat's ass about Spider-Man, and in the next she's admiring his good heart and bravery and feels inspired to change her own character flaws. Again, maybe the comics provide better answers, but here it comes out of the blue. Last but not least, to create tension, the game sometimes purposefully ignores the reach of Spider-Man's abilities, which can feel a little bit too constructed and artificial. A good example is the burning building scene. Spider-Man attaches his webs to the breaking platform and tries to hold it up long enough for Miles and May to escape. The reason why this scene is problematic is due to the fact that I could think of a dozen more effective ways to solve the situation while still being in line with Spider-Man's powers. Why doesn't he attach his webs to Aunt May and Miles themselves, as he has done countless of times before? Why isn't he attaching dozens of webs as he did during the subway sequence instead of just 2? Why is it so exhausting to hold the platform in the first place when he can pick up giant turrets and parts of concrete buildings with ease? But no superhero movie or game is truly free from these small inconsistencies, I guess. Okay, enough bitching. Let's talk about the fantastic ending. We all knew Octavius would turn into Doc Ock eventually, yet it didn't take away from the emotional impact of their final confrontation. The game spends so much time to show the great relationship between Octavius and Peter. It's easy to emphasize with Octavius since he suffers from a neuromuscular disease threatening to paralyze his entire body. And to add insult to injury, Osborn is sabotaging his research efforts. Doc Ock's actions are unforgivable, but you understand how he got there. It's not just that the arms are affecting his brain, it's the decade-long humiliation he experienced under the control of Norman Osborn, and the fear of his terrible disease. Octavius had to be stopped, that's undeniable, but just like Peter, the player is reminded of the brilliant scientist and good-hearted man he once was. It's heartbreaking to see Octavius begging Peter for help.
Please, Peter. That wasn't me. You said you'd never abandon me. You promised.
The reason why this last fight is such a fantastic climax to the story, apart from the amazing visuals and presentation, has to do with the fact that Peter is not just fighting a friend and mentor, but is desperately trying not to lose faith. The faith in his optimistic worldview. He always sees the good in people, even if they seem unredeemable. That's what Spider-Man stands for. Despite his personal sacrifices and hardships, he never loses his humor and willingness to help those in need. The circumstances force him to confront a dear friend and a man he deeply admired, a man who seemed to confirm Peter's belief in heroism and the willingness to sacrifice one's own life to a greater cause. As Peter rightfully points out, Doc Ock's hatred for Osborn made him throw all of this away. Dr. Octavius represented all he wanted to be, all the traits he valued most. Despite Peter's enormous money problems, despite better paid job offers, he decided to work for Octavius because he believed he could make a real difference under his leadership.
I came here to work for you because of what you've got up here. And that's not going anywhere. So neither am I.
It's also surprising how brutal certain scenes are. I mean, when Peter gets impaled by a metal arm, you really feel his pain. Funnily enough, it somehow reminded me of the fight scene between Green Goblin and Peter in Spider-Man 1. This movie isn't perfect, and Willem Dafoe's costume looks like a failed attempt to cosplay as one of the Power Rangers. But I really appreciate how hefty the blows feel and that Peter is fighting against someone he actually knows.
You do what you think is best, Doc. It's all any of us can.
Peter?
Even when it hurts like hell.
Peter, where are you going? Peter? Peter!
The Doc Ock confrontation is immediately followed by another great moment. Peter is faced with the difficult decision to save Aunt May or let her die in order to save thousands if not millions of others. It definitely feels forced and a little bit too constructed that they can't use one single drop of the antidote to save Aunt May, But it's only a minor complaint in an otherwise beautifully executed scene with fantastic voice acting, impressive facial capture, and a great emotional moment for the overall story. Peter has to make the ultimate sacrifice, and man does it hurt to see him lose yet another important figure in his life. It's not a flawless story by any means, but holy shit, the writers really nailed the emotional appeal of Spider-Man as a character. That's exactly what the Andrew Garfield movies and Homecoming were missing in my humble opinion. The game is not trying to be as gloomy and dark as the DCEU. It's still as humorous, lighthearted and colorful as you would expect from a Spider-Man story. But the game also knows when to raise the stakes, prioritize emotional impact over funny jokes, and apply real consequences to the characters' actions. It took the MCU forever to do that. A little bit of fine-tuning and the sequel could be a home run. Especially given the fact that Insomniac saved iconic villains like Venom and the Green Goblin for later entries. The game is close to being spectacular, but it isn't quite there yet. If we actually get to play as Miles Morales in the sequel, this interchanging narrative approach would make far more sense. Since Miles has superpowers as well, switching from one character to the next could work just fine instead of destroying the pacing. Wouldn't it be cool if the sequel lets you switch between Peter and Miles in certain sections because both have their own unique abilities? This way Insomniac could add even more depth and variety to the gameplay and get rid of the boring parts from the first game. I don't know how you could improve the web swinging any further since it already feels incredible. It may sound like a ridiculous idea, but one of the backpacks contained a prototype of underarm webs. If the sequel includes a set of functioning underarm webs, you could actually implement some Batman-like gliding. The question is if it would benefit the gameplay mechanics, since the web swinging is already really precise. Anyway, I really need to end this video, this is getting out of hand. Let me end by saying this. The future of superhero games looks bright. If the upcoming Avengers game is of the same quality as Insomniac's Spider-Man, and Rocksteady gives another famous DC superhero the Arkham treatment, superhero games don't seem to suffer from the great quality discrepancy we know from the DCEU and MCU in the movie business. Marvel and DC are both doing exceptionally well as far as video games are concerned. I'm sure the phenomenal success of Insomniac's Spider-Man will encourage Marvel to invest in even more video game adaptations. Insomniac was the best developer for the job. This much is certain.